The darkest secret of Persian history was hidden in a garden. Everyone who entered this garden would either die or go insane, because the Shah used this place to produce poison and silently eliminate his enemies. This story took place in the 16th century Safavid Empire and forms one of the darkest chapters in Persian history. Shah Abbas's poison garden wasn't just a botanical curiosity. It was the most insidious way to silently eliminate enemies. If you're fascinated by these buried historical secrets, don't forget to subscribe to Buried Truths and hit that like button. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's incredible how we're uncovering these dark secrets of history together, from different parts of the world, connected by our shared curiosity about the past. Isfahan was one of the world's most magnificent cities in the late 16th century. This city, the capital of the Safavid Empire, was famous for its architecture, art, and gardens. Shah Abbas's palace was considered the heart of this beauty. However, in the deepest corners of the palace, a secret that no one knew was hidden. Behind the Shah's private chambers, there was a secret garden accessible only to trusted servants. From the outside, this garden looked like an ordinary Persian garden. Shah Abbas had been interested in botany since his youth, but his interest wasn't beauty or scientific curiosity. He wanted to learn about the effects of plants on people, especially their deadly effects. The story begins when he was a young prince. Abbas had developed paranoia due to the intrigues and poisoning attempts in the palace. This paranoia led him to use poison for both defensive and offensive purposes. He began his first experiments with the palace gardener, Mirza Hassan. Hassan was an experienced man who knew the medicinal properties of plants. But the Shah's requests went far beyond normal treatment. "I need plants that kill," Abbas had said. "The kind that I can drop a few drops into my enemy's wine and make him writhe in agony for weeks." Hassan initially refused this request. But after the Shah's insistence and threats, he was reluctantly forced to become involved in this horrible project. Thus, one of history's most deadly gardens began to emerge. The first plant was an ordinary-looking rose variety. But these roses were specially cultivated, and the essences extracted from their leaves and flowers were turned into slow-acting poisons. The victims never realized that the beautiful-smelling flowers were actually causing their death. Over time, the garden expanded. Poisonous plants with different characteristics were planted in every corner. Some were instantly lethal. Some caused days of agony. The most cunning ones showed no symptoms for months and then silently killed the victim. Opium derived from poppy plants was one of the garden's most valuable products. But the Shah's poppy was very different from normal opium. It was processed through special procedures to become a mixture that was both addictive and deadly in the long term. Belladonna, meaning beautiful woman, was the garden's most insidious weapon. Its leaves were dried and turned into powder, mixed into the victim's food. At first, mild dizziness and blurred vision, followed by inevitable death. Ricin, obtained from the ricinus plant, was one of the most effective poisons of the ancient world. The Shah's gardeners processed the seeds of this plant to produce a toxin that was lethal even in microscopic amounts. Deadliest purpura, grown in a special section of the garden, was the same plant used as medicine by heart patients. But the dosage game made it deadly. The Shah's chemists prepared preparations from this plant that both killed instantly and stopped the heart in the long term. The most horrific section was the madness garden. The plants grown here caused not physical death but mental collapse. Victims first lost their memory, then their perception of reality became distorted, and finally they lived their lives in complete madness. Datura stramonium was the most effective tool for this purpose. This plant, also known as devil's apple, drove users into terrible hallucinations and permanently disturbed their mental balance. The Shah used this poison especially against his enemies' leaders. A special system had been established for operating the garden. The secret team working under Mirza Hassan's leadership was trained only in poison production. These people could never leave the palace due to the nature of their work, and took an oath of absolute silence to protect the secret. The poison production process was extremely complex. Each plant was harvested in different seasonal conditions, dried and processed using special methods. Chemists extracted the active substances from plants, concentrated them, and tried different combinations. The testing phase was the darkest part of the story. The effects of newly produced poisons were first tested on animals and then on criminals found guilty. These experiments also served to determine the effective dosage of the poison. Shah Abbas began systematically using the produced poisons against his enemies. At palace banquets, diplomatic meetings, and even gift deliveries, the seeds of secret death were sown. One of the first victims was an ambassador from the Ottoman Empire. The man was beautifully entertained every day during his stay in Isfahan. But the slow-acting poison mixed into his meals began to work after he returned to Istanbul. The ambassador died of a mysterious illness. This success further encouraged the Shah. The poison garden was expanded and production capacity increased. Now not only individual targets, but mass poisonings were also being planned. The biggest operation was carried out against rival Uzbek Khans. The Shah mixed specially prepared poisons into the food of a grand banquet organized under the pretext of peace negotiations. The result was dozens of Uzbek leaders simultaneously contracting mysterious diseases. However, such large-scale poisoning also brought attention. Spies from neighboring countries began to realize that what was happening in Isfahan was not normal. The Shah's enemies began to suspect that he was using poison. Marco Bellini, a merchant from Venice, was the first foreigner to accidentally discover the existence of the poison garden. He had befriended a servant who served as a guide in the palace and began receiving strange information from him. In Bellini's letters, details of what he described as the Shah's diabolical garden were included. These letters were received with great interest by intelligence circles in Europe. Meanwhile, problems began to appear in the team working in the poison garden. The gardeners, who were constantly in contact with poisonous plants, were experiencing health problems over time. Some showed signs of chronic poisoning, while others experienced nervous system damage. Mirza Hassan was the person most affected by this situation. After dealing with poison production for years, he himself began to be slowly poisoned. His hands were constantly shaking, and he often had hallucinations. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Hassan secretly began developing antidotes. But these studies were noticed by the Shah's spies. Hassan was accused of disloyalty and killed with the same poisons he had grown. After Hassan's death, the management of the garden was given to Ahmed Mirza, who was younger and more ruthless. Ahmed not only continued poison production, but also began developing new and more effective methods. Ahmed's greatest invention was the delayed death poison. This mixture showed no symptoms when it entered the victim's body, but after a certain period, usually 40 days, the victim would suddenly fall ill and die in a short time. The first test of this poison was performed on one of the Shah's most trusted viziers. The vizier had questioned the Shah's orders and proposed alternative policies. When he died of a mysterious illness 40 days later, no one thought it was intentional. However, the poison garden's activities were not only directed at external enemies. Shah Abbas also used this weapon against rivals within the palace, even against his own family members. The most tragic case occurred with the Shah's brother, Prince Darius. When Darius began claiming rights to the throne, he was given a specially prepared poison during a banquet. The prince died after 3 days of terrible agony. After this incident, the palace atmosphere completely changed. Everyone began to suspect everyone else. No one dared to eat food or accept gifts. Paranoia had penetrated every corner of the palace. Even the Shah's own food chain was affected. Now the cooks preparing his food would first taste it themselves before serving. Food was subjected to special tests, and antidotes were always kept ready. This climate of fear also began to affect diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors began to find coming to Isfahan risky. Trade volume decreased, and the Safavid Empire began to become isolated in the international arena. In the 1620s, it became clear that the situation had become uncontrollable. The poison garden was now attracting too much attention, and international pressure was increasing. Moreover, constantly living in fear of poison had also damaged the Shah's own mental health. Shah Abbas's final years were spent in constant paranoia about poisoning. He could not trust anyone, constantly took antidotes, and prepared his own meals. Ironically, the system he had established to poison his enemies was harming him the most. In 1629, Shah Abbas died of a mysterious illness. According to official records, it was a natural death, but some historians think he was also poisoned. Perhaps the system he created finally claimed him as a victim too. After the Shah's death, the poison garden was immediately closed. The new Shah did not want to inherit this dangerous legacy. All plants in the garden were burned, structures were demolished, and the area was completely cleaned. However, knowledge could not be completely destroyed. Some recipes and methods were kept in secret archives. This information continued to be used for different purposes in later periods. Ahmed Mirza and other poison experts were quietly killed. No witnesses were left to protect the secret. But some documents were found centuries later, bringing this dark story to light. Modern toxicology science studies the methods used in Shah Abbas's poison garden. Many ancient poison recipes, when analyzed with today's knowledge, proved to be effective. The most striking finding is how sophisticated the poison combinations were. These mixtures made in the 16th century, without modern chemical knowledge, can be considered successful even by today's standards. However, the saddest aspect of this story is the misuse of science. Shah Abbas's gardeners and chemists had turned nature's healing power into a destructive weapon. The poison garden is one of the dark pages not only of Persian history, but of humanity. It's a horrific example of how the powerful can misuse their resources. This story also shows how destructive paranoia and powerlessness can be. Shah Abbas, with the system he established to protect himself from his enemies, made himself everyone's enemy. Even today, we have similar concerns about biological weapons and chemical warfare agents. The Shah's poison garden sheds light on the historical origins of such dangers. In the old palace area of Isfahan, there are now beautiful parks and museums. But underground, traces of that horrible garden may still lie. History is sometimes full of dark secrets hidden beneath beauty. The story of Shah Abbas's poison garden shows how power corrupts and how fear brings destruction. Even 400 years later, these lessons should not be forgotten.